Recording. Greetings and welcome to Transformation Stories, thanks to Keto and Carnivore. I'm John, the Carnivore teacher, and today we're joined with an incredible guest who has completely transformed her life and healed herself. Monique, thank you so much for joining us. I appreciate it.
Lovely to be here, John. Happy to come back. You've interviewed me before. It was fun the first time. I'm assuming it's going to be fun the second time.
Yeah, definitely. What specific health issues or challenges were you facing before learning about Oxalate and basically switching to carnivore?
Gosh. Okay. My story is long because I started to get sick when I was a kid.
Wow.
So, honestly, I thought I had a lemon for a body. I'm sure there's lots of people out there who feel this way. I just thought that, I didn't get the best selection of genes from my parents and that, that was going to be my lot in life. So I first started having digestive problems when I was 7 or 8. Those proceeded all through my childhood and into my teen and young adult years. And interestingly enough, I was told when I was about 12, when my mom finally took me to the doctor for the whole, digestive problems, that I had a lazy stomach. So that's what I was told, as if it was somehow my fault or the fault of my stomach. Anyway, when I was 20, I had my gallbladder out. No, that's not a typo. 20. Yeah. And I was one of the youngest patients they'd had at our local hospital, blah, blah, blah. Turns out years later, I found out that gallstones can be made of oxalate. There can be calcium oxalate in there. So, yeah, it's possible that this all ties back to parents who thought they needed to feed us extra healthy and where we had to eat lots of potatoes. Anyway, fast forward a little bit. I was kind of unwell through most of my 20s, but, kind of in the normal range. But when I was about 24 or so kind of mid-20s, I woke up one morning and one of my ankles was sore. A very long story short, I ended up in a rheumatologist office, and I was adding a new joint to my list of very sore joints, about one a month or two. And so by the time I was 25, both ankles, both knees, one hip, some finger joints. I actually still have joints which are kind of to some degree distorted. You can see how crooked some of my fingers are still. She said I was one of the worst cases, the most sort of active and aggressive cases she'd ever seen in somebody who was as young as me, and that I would probably be in a wheelchair before I was 30.
Did they call it gout?
No. She said it was either psoriatic arthritis or rheumatoid arthritis. Okay. At that point in time, I was working at a library. I was actually working at the library at the University of Western Ontario, and I headed into a library science degree. And this is the 1980s. So I got access to online databases before most of the world did. And I started researching. So I made some changes to my diet. One of the things I did was I took gluten out. Gluten's actually one of the chronic sources of oxalate in our diet. Not super high, but high enough. And of course, things like potatoes are things that most people are eating every day. And so some of these things kind of dropped out of my diet. Because I was looking at things that were, I'm going to say, more inflammatory. Allergies ran in my family, so I was looking for autoimmune crossovers. So I went into the research and I did all this work and I changed my diet and I got off all the meds. And I went, this is pretty cool. But I continued to feel like a less than stellar specimen, so to speak. And from there, I went into my 30s and my digestion was getting bad. My thyroid was low. I just had a bunch of things going on. And then I decided to have babies in my 40s. So that was an adventure. And it was my second child who she was going with her brother and I to a naturopathic doctor because I was still thinking there's something wrong with my diet, but I didn't know what it was. And she developed some very distinctive symptoms. And this naturopathic doctor said, I think your daughter's got an oxalate problem. And I was about 48 at that point. And I looked at him, I said, what's an oxalate? I had never heard this word in my life. Of course, I'd never had a kidney stone. I'd never had a lot of issues that would have been associated with oxalate, but I had digestive issues. I'd had my gallbladder out. I had really poor energy levels. I had poor immune resilience. I'd had this bout with arthritis. I didn't recover from exercise well. There was just kind of a bunch of things going on. And around that time, I was also seeing a functional med guy who wanted to put me on thyroid meds. So I was trying to do everything right. I went low carb, so a very ketogenic diet. And I was eating spinach, and I was eating beet greens, and I was eating Swiss chard, and I was using almonds for snacks, and I was eating dark chocolate, and oh dear Lord. When we fell down the oxalate rabbit hole, I realized that my kids were having some difficulties at a very young age because their mother was eating this extra healthy diet that was sky high in oxalate. So for me, the first dietary change, which really turned out to be a game changer, was lowering oxalate because I'd been keto, I'd taken gluten out, like I'd done all sorts of things. But nothing had really gotten me to the level of health that I really, on some level, my intuition was saying, this is not right, it's not right, it's not right, it's not right. But at the same time, I thought I had a lemon for a body. After being low oxalate for a very long time, but having my blood sugar start to escalate, I decided that I would tackle carnivore. And I was trying to get at, I still had some remaining gut issues. So despite being a lot better and not having to take handfuls of digestive enzymes and ox bile and whatever else to get my food down, there was still, some lingering issues with heartburn and reflux and some things that I wasn't very happy with. And I was holding on to weight that I couldn't get rid of. So here I am now. I'm staring down the barrel at 65, trying not to pay too much attention to that. And I'm probably in the best health I've been since maybe my 20s. Like, I was saying to you before you started to record that we've had several days of snowmageddon here. So we've had about 2 feet of snow drop in about 48 hours. We don't have a snowblower. That's kind of foolish when you live in Toronto, but we don't. We have this little snow shovel thing. So between my husband and I, we were doing all this clearing of snow. And I was kind of waiting for it to hit, 2 days shoveling, second day, two times out there each day. And I'm thinking, okay.
You're waiting for the aches or the soreness to hit. Yeah.
For everything to hit, right? For the whole body to just seize up and go, oh, you've been bad.
Right.
Anyway, so yesterday I cleared a little bit in the morning, but nothing by then. The worst of the storm was over. And I'm still waiting now Tuesday for I'm not sore. So, that kind of resilience in the face of, a physical stressor on my body, but I couldn't have done that in my 20s even.
Oh, wow.
So it's diet has just been the total solution, I'm going to say, to everything that was going on for me. And what remains profoundly impactful to me is that I didn't get a lemon for a body. Not only did I not get a lemon for a body, if you put the right fuel in me, I'm pretty damn resilient. And I'm pretty damn resilient in my 6th decade. That's not, seventh decade, I guess, right? Because 6 would be your 50s. I'm in my 60s. So if I'm counting that right, yeah, I'm just astonished. So if you really fuel the body correctly, whatever your tolerances are for plants and stuff, mine are fairly low. But if you focus on essential nutrients, I'm going to say nutrient dense, low in toxin. So if you're going to eat plants, please don't eat the high toxin plants, right?
Right.
And whatever you're going to eat, focus first on the essentials. The essential nutrients are fatty acids and amino acids. We don't make these guys. We have to take them in. That's why they're called essential. We can make carbs. So there's still more research coming out right now, because I just saw one of my favorite follows on X, which is Nick Norowitz, talking about there are no essential carbs and that you don't need fiber for the gut. And these are all things that we all thought we knew and were doing right. Back in the days when I took psyllium husk every day, who knew? Who knew that in my 60s, I would not need any of that stuff, that my body would eliminate the way it's supposed to without any issues. And I had had chronic constipation for decades. So it's astonishing to me. Really. It really is. Our bodies are amazing things. They can recover if we give them the right nutrients. I'm going to say pretty much at any age, because if I could start at 48 and be as sick as I was, I honestly thought I wouldn't live to see my kids grow up. So that's a big deal, because I was just adding diagnoses all the time, and I was adding new problems all the time. And I thought, this isn't looking good. And I wanted, to see my grandchildren. So now I'm plotting for the grandbabies. Like, I don't want to be the grandma who sits on the bench while the kids play. I'm going to swing on those monkey bars with them. I got plans. And like, you have to be in good shape to do stuff like that. But that's where the fun is.
Absolutely. Now, you said you are 65? You will
Not
be 65?
quite, but I will be.
You're going to be 65. You don't look anywhere near that. What number would you assign yourself as to how you feel today?
I keep telling people that I'm gonna pretend I'm 40 as long as I can.
That's great.
Because honestly, that's closer to how I feel. How I felt before I had my son is actually, and I had my son at 40.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't actually feel as good as I do now. So I'm not going to let anybody call me a senior citizen until I at least have an 8 at the front of my nose.
All right.
Because I just don't feel that way. So as long as I don't feel that way.
Yeah, we've been told all our lives, you need to settle in. It's going to happen. You're going to get aches and pains. You're not going to be able to bend over. All these things when you hit, 50, right? 50-ish. And I'm approaching 60 myself, and I feel like I'm 30.
Honestly, and that's the benefit of the right
diet.
Yeah. When my daughter was 5, so that's my youngest one, I had her at 45.
Wow.
So at 50, I was taking her to kindergarten.
Mm-hmm.
And I was only a couple years into my oxalate journey, and I was still pretty tired. And I was still, there's a lot that your body has to do to deal with oxalate, because oxalate can become stranded in the tissues, as you and I know, and that takes some time for your body to move out. And we should be grateful for that, because if it all flooded your system all at once,
you'd be hospitalized.
You would be hospitalized.
Absolutely.
And I did have to walk into hospital a couple of times when oxalate was leaving my system, because it was just it gets that second kick at the can, so to speak.
Absolutely.
So here I am. I'm a 50-year-old mom of a 5-year-old, and I'm dropping her off at school, and she's kind of giving me a bit of the gears, and I'm kind of giving her a bit of the gears back. And all of a sudden I hear from somewhere else in the parking lot, over to the right of me, "You need to listen to your grandmother." And I'm thinking, there's all these kids coming in here. Other people are bringing, there's grandmas bringing in their kids. Where's that? Right. Anyway. So then my daughter said something else, and I said, "Come on, sweetie, you're going to be ready to play in that playground." Because she She normally was, so I didn't know what was holding her up. And then all of a sudden I hear again, no, you have to listen to your grandma. And my daughter, 5 years old, rears up, chest out, hands on her hips, and she says, that's not my grandma, that's my mama. And I go, oh no, they are talking about me. So it's funny because now my daughter is 19 and like all her friends can't believe that I'm the oldest mom of all of them because they're like, no, your mom's doing all this stuff. It's like, and my daughter's like, yeah. She takes credit though. She says that she keeps me young.
She and a healthy diet.
And a great diet.
And a healthy state of mind and an open mindset. All right. So for any of my listeners or people who are listening to this, they're following along. I've done interviews with you before, but for someone who's listening to this for the very first time, what is this stuff called oxalates?
Yeah, what the heck is an oxalate?
What is it? Because you didn't know what it was when you talked to your doctor that one time, 48 years old, your doctor said it might be oxalates. And you're like, what the heck is that? And I just discovered it maybe, when was it? 5 years ago when I got my kidney stone. And I realized I jumped down that rabbit hole and learned the word, first of all, oxalate. I mean, who knew? Like you, I was doing low carb with as much turmeric and cocoa and spinach, black pepper. I can't tell you. I think chia seeds. I was doing every single one you weren't supposed to do. And you learned the same thing. So what is this that people need to watch out for? And how can we get this out of our body properly? Because a lot of the advice out there is to just stop. And that's not the best advice.
Well, if you're driving your car at 60 miles an hour and you hit a wall, you just stop, but the stop is what'll kill you. And it's a little bit like that.
Okay.
So the problem with oxalate is that it's in a lot of these foods we think of as being extra healthy. So, nuts, almonds, and cashews are some of the worst. Leafy greens, so Swiss chard, beet greens, spinach, kale, like everybody seems to love these guys. They're some of the worst ones. A lot of your really healthy gluten-free alternatives. So for a while, teff was having a moment. It was an alternate grain flour, and oh my gosh, eye-wateringly high. And then, of course, you have your foodies who enjoy all these new novel foods. And so they're eating star fruit and they're eating kiwis. And unfortunately, those are very high in oxalate as well. But our beloved potato and sweet potatoes, which are part of almost every takeout food that you get, anytime you order a takeout meal, those are also extremely high in oxalate. And then the challenge, because I've just named off a bunch of foods which have no relationship to each other. So it's not like somebody can say to me or I can say to somebody else, ignore this category of food and you'll be fine. It's not like an allergy where you have at least a fighting chance, right? If somebody says, I can't have any wheat, well, then I'm going to avoid things that are grains because I'm not sure which things have wheat or not. So, but I have a fighting chance if I'm avoiding all grains, right? There is no way to easily avoid oxalate because most plants have an individual oxalate profile. And so leafy green like arugula is really low oxalate. Almost every lettuce on the planet is really low oxalate. But, other leafy greens could be really causing you some difficulties. So you kind of have to know more about foods and their oxalate profile to dodge well. But for sure, some of the things we think of as the healthiest things, like dark chocolate, like turmeric, like cinnamon, like almonds, these are all things that people are really revving up in their diets. And oh my gosh, easily you can be taking in, if you're eating almonds every day, you could be taking in 1,000 milligrams of oxalate without blinking. And if you really want to have a low oxalate intake, you should be in this 40 to 60 milligram range. So if you're taking in 1,000, you're taking in 20 times the amount that you should be taking in. And that's where the difficulty comes in, because people are following the nutritional advice. They're trying to do the right thing. Many of them are trying to eat lower carb, and they're substituting these things where they are just getting a blistering amount of oxalate from them. I've had clients start with me who have done at least some of the footwork to peg where they are with oxalate.
Mm-hmm.
I had one woman start where she knew that she was taking in over 3,300 milligrams of oxalate a day. She was eating paleo, and she was focused on, all the bad guys, all the bad guys. So, and these healthy chips that are coming out that are sweet potato and beet, I just cringe. There are times I walk through stores and I'm just doing this.
Have you tried those? I remember when I tried those thinking they're better than potato chips.
Oh,
Right?
back in the day. Yeah.
Not that long ago.
No.
The message, the knowledge is just not there.
No.
It's what is there is all the myths about cholesterol and saturated fat. There's all the wrong information out there, and we're not hearing this correct information about things that we need to look carefully at.
Yes.
Yeah. Can you describe for our audience what you talked about when it leaves the body? What does the oxalate do? What does it bind to? What is it doing that's damaging the body, causing these arthritic symptoms and everything?
Yeah. Well, it's kind of got three key things that it does, which in combination create all kinds of fun for us. So when we take it in, especially if we've been eating a meat and potatoes kind of diet for our whole lives, we may have been taking it in at a point in time when our health is pretty good. So you don't really notice it. But you are going to notice it on the way out, because by the time you start to reduce, your health is compromised in any way, then your body's going to have some difficulty with this. And the reason for that is oxalate's a mineral chelator. So by default will deplete us of minerals that are very important. It's actually looking for what I call a preferred dance partner. So positive minerals, because it's a negative ion, and that's going to balance out its charge. But the problem is these beautiful positive minerals, calcium, magnesium, zinc, iron, and it can do things like take 2 potassium, take 2 sodium. So it can be affecting all kinds of things. So not just, I'm going to say the structural minerals, things like calcium, magnesium, they're involved in structure. Magnesium's involved in all kinds of things in terms of energy production, zinc for immune resilience. So it's affecting all of these things. But for somebody who's gone keto or carnivore and is not taking in enough minerals, and then oxalate leaves their body and insulin's dropping, so we're shedding electrolytes, and then oxalate's taking electrolytes as well, you can have all kinds of crazy things that happen that are involved with just that aspect of what oxalate does. And then on top of that, turns out that oxalate turns on the inflammasome. Okay, so now I've probably used 2 words that people don't know, oxalate and inflammasome. So oxalate is this negative ion, but it's pro-inflammatory. And the inflammasome is your cell's ability to essentially respond to inflammatory stressors. And that's normally a good thing. You get a bug or a virus, you get some inflammation, things happen, but that's part of the healing process. So oxalate is a sterile inflammatory driver. And so you may not have anything else going on, but once it's in those tissues, it can help to drive inflammation. So that can help with things like my muscles don't recover, my gut's off. Like there's a host of things that can go along with driving inflammation. And if you've got another inflammatory process going on, I've fallen, I've had a surgery, I've had some kind of injury, and oxalate can be making that more difficult for you to heal because it's attracted to these sites of inflammation. And then the third biggie is that oxalate can be taken up in a kind of mistaken identity by cell transporters that are trying to move nutrients into the cell. And that's part of the way that it gets access to different tissues where it then causes some problem. So oxalate can be moved by cell transporters that move sulfate. And that's one of the reasons why it can turn up in bile, because the liver is making bile and oxalate might be present in those cells, and oxalate gets secreted out. So it may be secreted out with the bile, and that's how it can turn up as a gallstone, because oxalate's been picked up by the liver. And if you think of my hand as a cell transporter, because that's kind of an easy visual, cell transporter comes out of the front of the cell. It's after sulfate in the liver's case, right? And it picks up oxalate instead, because there's an ending on this cell transporter that's compatible with both sulfate and oxalate. If the cell transporter is working correctly, it takes sulfate in. And if we produce some oxalate at the cell level, because we do produce some out of our metabolism, that's how our body knows about moving it out. So that cell transporter should pull sulfate in, and it should push oxalate out. If it works the wrong way around, where it's pulling oxalate in because there's lots in the bloodstream, the cell transporter will drop it in the cell, and the cell goes, can't do anything with that, right? And if the cell's going to spend energy, it's going to spend on trying to get the nutrient it was after in the first place. It's going to wait to get rid of these other things for when it's got more resources. So if the cell transporter goes out again and pulls in oxalate again and again and again, so you can end up with oxalate starting to accumulate in the tissues, because these tissues are going to be, their first priority is the function they were trying to do. And they will wait till they have enough energy to get rid of the oxalate. So you have this time displacement between when the oxalate might have been brought into the tissues and when those tissues go, right, I got to clean out, and it dumps that stuff out into the bloodstream. That can be happening with different kinds of cell transporters in different tissues. The liver is just a really great example. Now, how the body gets rid of oxalate is by secretion. And so it takes energy for tissues to secrete. And that's why oxalate can be accumulating until the tissues get rid of it.
That's called dumping, and that time frame, like in my body, every couple of months I have an oxalate dumping episode, and they're getting smaller and smaller, and I kind of know what they are now. I sense them, and I'm still getting them. And is that what that is? My body's reaching a point where it's I don't know, it's pulling in what it needs, it has enough, and now it says, now let's get rid of this.
Yeah, essentially. And we don't know enough about the process. So though the kinds of things I'm saying are our understanding at this point. I'm hoping there'll be more. But the reason it takes time to secrete it back out is that once oxalate's in the cell, it's a mitochondrial disruptor. So then the mitochondria is not making as much energy, and the cell will have priorities about where it's going to use that energy. And that's part of the reason why the cell might say, right, don't have enough energy to start dealing with the little garbage heap in the back corner over there. We're going to ignore that. We're going to focus on trying to get done our work because that's higher priority. So the body has kind of programming, and oxalate, unfortunately, is functioning in a way in the body where the body's natural programming may not be to our advantage.
Would we call that oxalate? The body considers the oxalates a lower priority to everything else it's trying to do. So that's why it takes time.
Yes and no. Like, I don't want to overstate the case,
Okay.
but once it's in the cell's going to potentially prioritize the work it was trying to get done before it gets rid of the oxalate, because we have this mitochondrial piece where if there's energy compromise, the cell's going to have a list of priorities that may not include secreting out this thing that it's wanting to get rid of. But that does tend to be exactly what you're talking about, dumping. So a bunch of tissues go, right, we got enough energy, things are going well enough. This is going to leave the cells now. And so it tends to hit the body's bloodstream in waves. And then we have to clear it. And it's going to be secretion in each step when we're trying to get rid of it. So it's the kidneys are going to, for most of us, do the lion's share of the work. And that's why people who get kidney stones, this is usually the way they figure out about oxalate. But then you have people like me who have never had a kidney stone in their life. And if they're lucky, somebody says oxalate in their presence so that they can figure this out, because I had compromise across my entire body between joints and muscles and digestion and thyroid and my sleep. I forgot to mention that one. I just looked like the whole lemon for a body thing again. It was, and oxalate just has this capacity to be trafficked into tissues based on what cell transporters are doing. And then you can have problems in places that we're not looking for. And because we don't look for oxalate anywhere else but the kidneys, we're not finding it because we don't look for it.
Yeah, we're not looking for it, and doctors aren't talking about it. Go into the doctor's office. First, they don't ask you what is your diet. It's what is your symptom, so they can pair it with a medicine. And you never hear the word oxalate. I went into the optometrist a couple of years ago and I had a dumping in my eyelid. Okay,
Yes.
I think that's what it was. After learning about this, it was scraping it was terrible for a few weeks. Never heard of it. The optometrist never even heard of the word oxalate.
Yes, and
As a
that's
medical
so
school,
frustrating.
it blows my mind away. I mean, am I crazy? Am I wrong to believe this stuff if the doctor never even heard of an oxalate?
Well, in the eye, we should talk about these eye symptoms because they're one of the weird ones where, again, if somebody's never had a kidney stone, this might be their cue.
Yeah.
But people who get like crystals around the eyes, there's research from the world of hyperoxaluria. So that's those who have a genetic problem where their body is producing too much oxalate. And it talks about oxalate being marooned in the eye and then the kinds of damage that it can do. And now we have, through the Triangle Oxalate Support Group, which is on Facebook and Groups.io, and I participate in that as my pay it forward kind of work. We have reports, not just me, but others, where it felt like there was something in their eye. I went to ER because it was bad enough. I was like, I have to figure what's going on in here. By the time I got there, doctor dilated, used a big lens to look at my eye, blah, blah, blah. And he said, okay, whatever was in there is gone. And I'm like, okay, that's good. But he said, you've got a cut on your cornea. And I was like, and I know there was nothing that went in there. So it was something that came out of there. And we hear lots of reports from people of like, they get up in the morning and they can wipe away crystals from their eyes.
I've heard that, yeah.
Yeah. So it's one of those places where if you're getting more than what I would call a normal amount of, sleep in your eyes, when people wake up, maybe there's a little bit of something in the corner of your eye and it's hard and you've got eye irritation, or you're prone to a lot of styes, or you're prone to a lot of your eyes breaking blood vessels or things. I would be really suspicious about oxalate with what I know now, because I have not had a crystal, a stye, anything again in a very long time. But once the oxalate was out, I didn't have to worry about it anymore.
Yeah, mine too. I washed mine frequently, and it was still there, the feeling, until it took a while, and I guess it came out. I haven't had a problem with it since. My next question for you, and it's kind of complicated.
Okay.
All right, I'd like to know, I think I talked about it in the last one, approximately how much oxalate does my own body create as a metabolic endpoint if I'm not taking practically any in because I'm a carnivore? If I were to take some in, what's a safe level per day plus the amount my body's making? So what's that total level that would keep me safe? And then vitamin C, glycine, threonine, some of the other things that can add on to it if you're not careful. Like nobody knows this information. So can we talk about that?
Sure.
Okay.
So let's break it down a piece at a time.
Okay.
So most of us are going to be making in the range of, say, 30 or so milligrams of oxalate based on some sources that I've read. So not a lot that's coming directly out of our metabolism. We can start to make more out of our metabolism if we don't have enough B6. So I sort of think of this as the fork in the road on your metabolic pathways. So if you get to this one particular fork in the road when it comes to production of energy, for instance, if B6 is in the fork of the road, you produce a recyclable end product. If B6 is not in that fork in the road, you produce oxalate. So in the citric acid cycle or the Krebs cycle, there is a point where if you don't have B6, you're going to produce a molecule of oxalate. And so enough B6 is a big deal. So having a diet which is, I'm going to say, replete in B6, like it's got lots of it, that's a really important thing. And for some people, supplementing some will be important because stress eats up B6. There's lots of things that can eat up how much B6 you have. With that in mind, most of my clients are probably coming down into the range of 60 to 80 milligrams of oxalate from their diet a day. And that for a lot of people would be sufficient. My kids eat in that range generally, and they do fine at that range. There may be some of us who have to stay lower than that because if your gut's leaky, you may be absorbing more oxalate, or we could have other genetic factors which might affect oxalate. And I don't know enough about those to wade into that area. But there are some genetic SNPs that I've heard about, which might be ones to think about. And we might want to be checking into if we're having difficulties with oxalate. One that I know of is a glycine SNP, which means that we're more likely to metabolize glycine into oxalate. So when it comes to these other sources, like what could we be turning into oxalate? We know that glycine is one of them. Honestly, unless you're eating grams and grams of isolated glycine, I would not worry too much about that one. But if you've got glycine SNPs, which might contribute to you metabolizing this more freely into oxalate, then that might be something to think about. Most amino acids are, potentially a source where we could be metabolizing oxalate. But again, I wouldn't worry about these as long as you're not eating concentrated, isolated sources. And the big ones that we do have research on, which say that we end up with more oxalate out of our metabolism, would be collagen and like gelatin and potentially hydroxyapatite. If we're consuming those as isolated sources, so there's no indication if you sit down and eat a steak, for instance, that the collagen in that steak is going to be turned into oxalate. So why would that be? That an isolated source would be a problem and a whole food one's not. It's the B6 in the food, right? So the nutrients you need to be able to metabolize that natural whole food tend to be supportive there. So I would always tell people, if you need more collagen, eat more meat. If you need more gelatin because you're worried about, supporting your joints, eat more meat. I would not ever suggest to people, buy a hydrolyzed collagen or buy an isolated gelatin and take it on its own, because that's where you're setting yourself up for an imbalance between nutrients, and that's where the problem gets created. The question of how much can I take in and be safe is a really tough one, but I've thought about this a little bit. And given that our bodies produce about 30 milligrams And if you look at most human systems, those systems can tolerate a stressor sometimes up to 10 times a normal amount. Now, not everybody, but like
Mhm.
look at things like blood pressure. When you're lifting heavy weights, your blood pressure can be skyrocketing. The heart has no problem with that, right? So in short spurts, could we handle maybe a higher bit of oxalate? Possibly. So let's say the top end of the kidneys is about 300 milligrams, but you can't do that every day. You
Right.
can't run the kidneys at the top end, right? So the problem is that these are questions that I'm hypothesizing about wildly when I say this. And we don't really know the answer. So how much oxalate, and we don't know if it's unique to each person. Like we don't know how each person would be
Well,
affected, right?
body weight, genetics, gender, all those variables. Yeah, I get it.
Yeah, yeah. So it's interesting. Almost everything in the human body can affect oxalate trafficking. So neurotransmitters, hormones, like this is a really complicated toxin, which kind of makes it past our defenses in a way that has allowed it to be very insidious. And because we don't look for it outside the kidney, again, we don't find it.
True. All right, here's a question that just popped into my head as you said that. I attended the Symposium for Metabolic Health in Boca recently. It was the main focus was on women's health, and I learned so much about how different our bodies are because of the hormones, estrogens, and the different times of the cycles and everything. Have you come across any like dramatic differences because of gender, because of the hormones, estrogen, testosterone, as that relates to oxalates?
Yeah, that's a big one. What I'll say is this: a lot of women, especially when they are still experiencing menstruation, so anybody pre-menopause, um, many women will have like a mini oxalate dump as they come into their period. And I was like,
Huh.
what the heck is going on here? Turns out I found a couple of things in the research. One, estrogen is protective against the effects of oxalate. So that's very intriguing.
Hmm.
And two, that gave me a clue as to what was happening as people came into their period because estrogen's dropping as you come into your menstruation. So the thing there is, what if PMS, which is rampant, isn't really PMS? What if it's this mini oxalate dump, which is happening month after month after month after month? And I really had to do a lot of thinking about that because a lot of clients who don't see a distinctive pattern when they first start with me, and I suspect that's because they have a lot of oxalate to get rid of.
Hmm.
But as they go along through the process, all of a sudden they're starting to see this monthly cycle thing. So that in some ways makes it easy because if the body's kind of triggering off a predictable cycle of dumping, you can get out in front of it.
True.
And we don't have that with men. So with
Mhm.
men, I don't have that kind of thing where I can help them kind of go, oh yeah, this is going to happen. So I'm going to be ready for it. We don't have that. But I would also say uniquely susceptible, in my opinion, to inflammatory effects of oxalate and outside the kidneys would be tissues that are targets of sex related hormones. So with men, I see them more often having issues with prostate,
Mhm.
and with women, more often having issues with what they call interstitial cystitis. So things where you've got, sexually sensitive tissues and sex hormone sensitive tissues, and they seem to be more vulnerable, I'm going to say, at least to the inflammatory effects of oxalate. You can get it everywhere, but I hear a lot about those kinds of issues for people where there's not an obvious trigger for why they would have that except for oxalate.
I'm learning that when we don't know the answer to something, think oxalate.
I actually have t-shirts, and I was going to wear one and I realized I've forgotten. I've got a t-shirt now that says "When in doubt, blame oxalate," because I think it's funny.
I would wear that, at least as a conversation starter, just
I
to
think
talk to
it's funny,
people.
but it's true. It's almost
It
like,
really is. It really is. Yeah.
yeah. So there are so many little fingers, tendrils to places where oxalate could be affecting things. And even if it's not the primary driver, I'm not saying it's the primary driver for
Mhm.
everything. Um, but I'd say it's a co-conspirator with whatever other factors you have going on.
You talked in the past about when you talk about oxalates along with another toxin, like I don't know if salicylate's a toxin, but goitrogens, phytates, lectins, if they're present, would that make the oxalates act differently or be worse?
I think if your body's struggling with any other kind of toxin, that if you're adding oxalate, it's going to be a problem,
Okay.
right? So let's say you are somebody who has unique vulnerability for the thyroid. Um, Unfortunately, thyroid's one of the places where oxalate accumulates. So
Oh.
you add oxalate plus
Mm.
goitrogens, and people can be really struggling with their energy levels and, you know, managing resilience in the face of cold or other kinds of things that are affected by low thyroid hormone. And in some cases, they don't even test low in thyroid hormone. But the problem is that your body has to be able to use it, and if oxalate's disrupting that as well. But there's just so many places where I have questions, because
Mm.
I can see clients who share tests with me, and they'll say, well, my TSH looks okay and my thyroid hormone looks okay, but I'm really cold and I'm struggling with weight. And it's I'll try things that are thyroid supportive, that are related to oxalate, and many times those people will start to improve, and yet their tests didn't show that.
Hmm. Okay. Let's go on to your carnivore diet. You now call yourself a carnivore.
Yes.
And when did you start calling yourself that? When did this kind of change?
I guess it's probably a couple of years ago where I went, okay, I'm done. I'm not going to try and figure out what's going on with my system. I'm just going to try this carnivore thing. And honestly, I haven't been a pristine carnivore. Like, I will probably never give up my coffee. I will probably never give up the occasional treat when there's a special family occasion. So I don't do nutty things. I'm not going to sit down and have a piece of cake because I just don't wanna.
Mhm.
But we'll often celebrate a birthday with like berries and whipped cream.
Mhm.
We might go out on a limb and have berries and whipped cream. So I'm not a perfect carnivore, but so much improved over where I used to be. The biggest thing for me is I have to give up dairy, and I
Oh,
do
I
not
love
want to
dairy
give
too.
up dairy,
I love it too.
but it's so hard. It's one of those foods that for me just doesn't
Oh,
work.
okay. Either the lactose or one of the proteins probably isn't
Well,
happy with you.
I've done a lot of research on this one too. Turns out that when we digest casein,
Mhm.
some of us are producing casomorphins, and those are what they sound like. They're an
Yeah.
opioid-like peptide, and they mess with addictive centers. They can mess with, actually, they can affect motility and transit time in the gut.
Mm.
Um, there's all kinds of things they can be doing. And they unfortunately do all of them to me.
Ah, and that's another feature about this is it's never ever one size fits all. When
No.
I listen to everybody on YouTube, all the doctors and nutritionists, it the advice, the information that we're talking about is all in context with an individual's uniqueness. We're so unique. What works for me doesn't work for you, and so on.
Yeah, I try very hard to encourage people, if they don't have clear signs that there's dairy intolerance, that they keep it in their diet.
Okay.
And I actually do that because of the mineral chelation aspect of
Calcium.
oxalate. So
Hmm.
if you're taking in mineral dense foods, I'd like you to keep that, right? And that really you're getting phosphorus, calcium, magnesium, you're getting all kinds
All
of
the good
things
stuff.
from dairy products. But if you don't tolerate them, I'll help people go through the experiment of, does A2 dairy work better than A1? A1 casein is the kind that conventional milk cattle produce, but you can get A2 casein, and that's goat, sheep, or cattle that are older breeds that produce this A2 casein. And for some people, they will handle that better.
Hmm.
Um, and then if they're not handling that, then we've got to go down the list to getting the minimum amount of, I'm going to say, the protein in the product. So maybe they can handle butter. I'm so bad I can't even do butter. Got to go to
Oh,
ghee.
really? Oh,
Yeah.
oh, ghee is wonderful too.
Yeah. So, but yeah, you're right. It's unique.
Everybody, yeah, you're responding differently than I do, and it's
And what I do instead, this is mineral water. So I get
okay.
my calcium that way.
Mhm.
Because I feel like it's important to get enough minerals. Not
Mhm.
that I'm eating a lot of oxalate at this point, and I should be pretty clear of it. We think it takes around 7 years to be completely clear. So, but bones, blah blah blah. So yeah, this is Gerald Steiner, which is a mineral water where there's like 500 milligrams of calcium per,
Oh,
I think, 24-ounce bottle. It's pretty good.
good.
And it's all really bioavailable because it's dissolved in the water, so your body doesn't have to fight to get it either. So.
Right. I remember you saying that in one of your other videos about drinking it in a water form is more just absorbed faster, easier, more
Yeah, if it's
readily.
ionic and it's
Ionic,
not
yeah,
bound to something else,
makes
right?
sense. Hmm.
Then you have a much better chance of getting it into the
Makes
system.
a lot of sense. All right, last question. What are your thoughts on, oh, I don't know if you can see it here, Sally K. Norton's book, Toxic Superfood, and you're a wealth of information. Have you ever thought about writing your own book? Seriously.
Yes, I have been thinking about writing my own book for years, and it's the tough thing is, like, I have to stop doing other things to be able to write
Okay.
the book. But I am in the throes of trying to, like, get something collated. I've been writing um, on my Patreon, excuse me, on my Patreon group for years now, and I think the book's there. So at this point, I'm kind of thinking maybe I just go through that material and sort of bring it together, and then the book can go out faster as opposed to sooner, as opposed to later, as they would say.
Hmm. All right. I would
Um,
absolutely order it and buy it.
well, that's lovely. Thank you. Sally's book is a good book.
Uh-huh.
Um, since it came out, like, unfortunately, the research keeps changing.
It
The
does.
the you know the stakes in the ground keep moving. So there are things that she has suggested to people where I definitely wouldn't suggest those things based on my knowledge.
Mhm.
And I think the biggest one is that you can have people develop histamine issues as oxalate is affecting their system.
Mm.
And that turns out to be a pretty common, as they would say, comorbidity of oxalate. So you made mention of salicylate. That's another one where it's a kind of a known comorbidity
Mhm.
among the oxalate community. And so one of the things that Sally suggests is that people use things like black tea to get some oxalate so they don't drop too quickly. I would never recommend black tea because of this histamine aspect.
Oh.
I would probably suggest to people, if they're coming down from oxalate, especially if they've had high intake at any time in their life, because
Mhm.
I was a vegetarian in my 20s, and I sure there was still oxalate hanging around in my system from that. So if you want to go to carnivore, the biggest thing there is, as we were saying at the beginning, sort of the sudden stop of
Okay.
oxalate, and then having it move too aggressively out of your system and knocking yourself on your butt. And there is no prize to doing this faster.
Right.
You need to have the resilience to handle your life at every step while this stuff's coming out. So I would keep maybe lower histamine spices in your diet. As much as I'm not a fan of turmeric, it can give you a fair amount of oxalate without, you having to eat a bunch of plants to do that. You could also do, I think I have a recipe on my Patreon for something like a golden milk, so that you could use, like, that's having a moment out there, these people drinking turmeric
Right. Mhm.
drink, right? But you could use something like that as part of your approach to dropping down your oxalate, because then you've got this thing, it's separate from the rest of your diet, and you can pull it out a little bit at a time. And I would probably consider, lower oxalate, not lower histamine, I should say, because we're trying to keep some oxalate in the diet. Lower histamine fruits or veggies, because at least those are more nutrient dense than a grain or a legume or a higher carb thing. So that you could retain the benefits of being lower carb, but not be pulling more than one lever. When you're adding oxalate to the system, you just want to pull the oxalate lever. You don't necessarily want to be adding histamine or salicylate or other stressors at the same time. So my thought is that if you're going to add oxalate to the system, I know that adding black tea is easy, but I wonder about people ending up having more histamine issues because they're adding oxalate from this higher histamine source.
Hmm.
So the dreaded sweet potato that I just slagged at the beginning of our chat here would be one of the ones that I would consider. It's a little bit lower in carb. It's a fair amount of oxalate in a small amount. So it's not like you have to throw off your body in a big way. But what it does is mean that there's some oxalate coming in through the gut, and it's not been characterized, but it looks like there's some kind of signaling. It says, well, tissues, you have to wait because there's oxalate coming in from the gut, so you can't release
You
everything.
don't.
So you just want to kind of moderate that process. You don't want to stop it forever, but you don't want it also to be too aggressive. So the idea is that's a bit of a balancing act.
And it's tricky to know just how much sweet potato, or if I'm gonna do a little bit, like, I wanna do it to not crash the wall. And again, this is so nuanced. It's like, what's the level? How much should I have? What's too much? What's not enough?
Yeah. I would say to most people that if you came from sky high levels of oxalate, do not drop like a rock.
Yeah.
Like, think about a 6-month plan to get to maybe a couple 100 milligrams of intake.
Okay.
Because you really don't want to, like, aggressively hit the system. So I'm moving in the direction of carnivore, great, but think about it over a 6-month time period. Once you get to that 200 milligram amount of intake per day, then maybe you can start to vary it a little bit. I put people on what I call a wave,
Mhm.
kind of in opposition to dumping, where they're a little bit higher in oxalate, and then they go down to, if they're going carnivore, maybe close to zero. And then they go up a little, 2 or 3 days later, and then they go down again. And then that sort of provides a bit of pushback to the system, but your overall average intake of oxalate is coming down. And then we just start to pull down the peak of the high oxalate days. So there's many ways that it can be done. And for some people, it helps to be just responsive to when they feel oxalate dumping starting. So they feel oxalate dumping starting, they've got, whatever kinds of foods on hand, and they up their oxalate in response to that, just to kind of slow things down. Over time, that won't work as a strategy forever. You kind of hit a point where there's enough oxalate gone from your body, and your body's kind of committed to the process, that you could come up in your intake and it's going to go, nope, not paying
Hmm.
attention to you. But hopefully by that point, you've had a chance to explore what supplements help, what other tools can be in your toolkit. Um, there's a lot of pieces that can be helpful, including supplements, where it can really help to just buffer some of those symptoms and bring them down. So I've gone through oxalate dumps where I hardly felt anything taking MSM for me. But again, you kind of have to get into the person's biochemistry a little bit, I'm going to say, without me knowing exactly what's going on in their body, but we might try things. I might say, let's try MSM. They say, well, that wasn't fun. Okay, that's not your help, right? So it might be some other supplement, but something that they can do in response to when oxalate starts to move. For some people, it's as simple as Epsom salts baths, but that's really,
yeah, you've mentioned that a lot. Yeah.
yeah,
Interesting.
that worked for me like a charm as well. So it really depends where oxalate has done the most compromise, where you've trafficked it more capably, and then what nutrients you're deficient in and how well you can handle the sulfur. So that, yeah, it does become a little
It's
tricky.
tricky, and we have to figure out our own self. What's my prescription for myself? And it's different for everybody.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. This has been fantastic, enlightening as usual. I learned so much from you. Thank you so much. Where can people find you? Several places on the internet.
Yep, they can find me all over the place.
Okay.
Perhaps more places than I want to be. I'm actually on the dreaded TikTok, so they
Is
can
it?
find me there.
So you're in TikTok. All right.
Yeah.
Are you going to dance? Are you dancing and saying oxalate? No.
Oh Lord, no. No. It's
That's
my
not, I
son's
don't do
fault.
TikTok. I just think TikTok's all dances. I don't know.
Oh, it's my son's fault. And I guess there's not that many nutritionists there. So apparently,
Well, then stay on there. You'll be the
yeah,
only one.
apparently I
Right.
might be helpful there. I'm also on Instagram. I am on Facebook. So you can find me as Monique Attinger Nutritionist. That's my account. And I have a Low Ox Coach page on Facebook. And then I am on X and I am on YouTube. So there's a variety of ways where you can find me. And on YouTube, lots of videos trying to help get this information out to people. I do have a subscription group on Patreon. So that's patreon.com. It looks a lot like Facebook for people who like that kind of a format.
Mhm.
But it's a subscription. So they pay a little bit of money, but I provide things like menu plans. And if they subscribe I have 3 different levels. If they subscribe at the top level, they get a free Zoom with me every month.
Okay, great.
Seems like a good deal to me. Anyway.
For sure, absolutely. Okay, so Low Ox Coach
Yep.
on TikTok
Yep.
and Instagram,
And
X,
Instagram. Yeah.
YouTube. Low Ox Nutritionist is your website. Or
Low Ox Coach is my
Low
website.
Ox Coach, but
.com.
Monique Attinger Nutritionist is something else.
Is on Facebook.
That's Facebook.
And I'm actually competing with myself on X. I'm actually Low Ox Coach 1 on X. I had set up an account as Low Ox Coach years ago, and I sort of lost control of it. So I'm now Low Ox Coach 1 on X.
So you probably have both, but one of them's more active than the other one or something.
The other one should still belong to me, but I can't get them to give it back to me.
Oh, one of those deals. I get it.
One of those. I can't prove it's me because I don't have the email address anymore.
Oh, gosh. Okay. All right. Well, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much for the average Joe and Joanne who are listening to this. Oxalate. Let's add oxalate to our vernacular, to our consciousness, and think about oxalates, because nobody is. Most people are not. And people need to start thinking about that. And it's more prevalent than we ever knew.
Yeah. And it's a
People like you.
toxin, and we pretend like it's not.
Right.
So yeah, we just want people to be aware of that so that they're not trying to do everything right and ending up sicker than they were before.
Right. Right. Which is often the case. Oh, I'm eating the way mainstream tells me to eat, and it's getting worse. Thank you so much for the information. Hang on here while I end the recording so I can say goodbye to you properly. And this has been John Laspina, the Carnivore Teacher, and stay tuned for another interview coming up in the future.